I thought I'd go over today some similarities and differences between a sit-on-top kayak and a solo canoe for float fishing. This is my Liquid Logic sit-on-top kayak. This particular brand of kayak is no longer made today, but there are a lot of brands that you can choose from. One of the things that I did was add these Scotty rod mount holders to it, these flush mounts. And I like the Scotties because you can set them at different angles. You can move them various positions. A lot of the kayaks that are made for fishing have those holes in them that have the rods that basically stick in that hole. And that works well for a lot of conditions, particularly for ocean conditions and the like. They're fairly easy to get to, but the reason I preferred these was because I do a lot of river fishing and medium and smaller streams where you might get close to the bank and float under trees, and the rod can catch, and if the rod's at a lower angle, I find that it's much more likely to do so, so I prefer this particular type of mount. And one of the other things that I did was I added a drag chain, and you can see this parachute type cord just releases, and the drag chain will go back and forth. It's a very simple setup. This is just a jam cleat. I can add more chain to the drag if I want to get myself going slower. Most of the time I don't actually like to stop. I just like to do what I think they call river slipping, and basically that's a slower speed to fish with. I also added a mount for my GoPro. Basically this telescopes. I mount the camera inside. I can set it to various angles. It does have a battery bank, and I have a setup that when I put the camera inside, there's actually a little pack in there. You can kind of see it, and that will fit into the back of the camera. Again, it goes through this cord to the battery bank, which plugs in, and that thing lasts, gosh, all day, maybe even 2 or 3 days before it charges. It has a tremendous power reserve, and I like that because if you're filming along the stream, and I'm certainly no expert at that, but you don't have to worry about your battery power running out. I use a cushion quite often on the seats. I added these cloth type of, I think they were an adhesive pad just for my legs. I do prefer foot pegs, would recommend them as opposed to the molded footrest, because these you can move and it makes it a little bit more comfortable. And I added some bungee cord on this particular hatch just to add a little bit more security. So that's my basic sit-on-top kayak setup. This is my solo canoe setup. This is an Old Town Discovery 119 solo canoe. One of the things you notice about the solo canoes is that the seat, obviously it's a single seat, it's a little further forward than the tandem canoes would be. I've got this canoe used, and I did have to recane the wicker seat, and I did add a wicker backrest. The plus of this, maybe compared to the kayak, would just be a little more comfortableness with the seat. You sit a little bit higher up. You've also got a lot of room to store gear in. I do usually put the padded seat here, and it'll actually clip underneath to hold it steady. That's a little bit more comfortable. You can see I added a cup holder, so that's right next to me. I also used the Scotty rod holders. I used their mount for that. It's a little different mount than the flush mount, but it mounted on the side, and that worked fine. I secured a carton, put my gear in just so that it doesn't move. I also used the same setup on the kayak with the jam cleat with the parachute type cord for the anchor setup, and really it's just the same setup, basically going to the stern of the kayak. I did fashion this holder for the anchor rope, and again I just attach a chain here. It's very similar, and it's at the stern of the kayak as opposed to the front, which I personally prefer. For the front rod holder, I used a little different setup with the grooved running mount, and this was a side mount actually. I can turn this upside down if I store the kayak. And the reason I didn't want one on top was because if you're car topping, it would probably grab the rails of the car. So this I can flip upside down when not in use, and it's a side mount, so I can slide this forward or back to get a little bit more comfortable position when I'm fishing, so I preferred that as well. I do use a kayak paddle with this kayak as opposed to a canoe paddle. I found that really works well. This particular paddle has two settings. I've got it usually set up a little further out because of the draft of this, the boat being a little bit higher in the water than say your kayak would be, and that seems to work out really well. So that is the basic setup. They're both great crafts. I would say that if I'm doing rapids like maybe class 2, with the scupper holes especially for fast water, I can pull those out. I think the kayak is just a little bit more stable. The canoe might be just a little bit more comfortable. If you're crossing a broad river, it can catch some wind. I still have pretty good speed with it. This one, with the amount of rocker it has, is very easy to turn. It's more or less a matter of preferences, and just as I say, I think the basic difference would be if I'm going to do some faster water, I would probably prefer the kayak as opposed to the canoe. And it might be just slightly a bit more stable than a canoe because your center of gravity is just a little bit lower, particularly for rapids. But this is still a pretty stable craft. It's comfortable to fish out of. So depending on the waters that I do, I'll choose one or the other. I have to say that these days it seems that kayaks have become tremendously popular as fishing craft, and you really can't go wrong with them. But the Old Town Discovery 119 is a fairly comfortable craft, and not a bad option either. So those are the two.